I'm here today with James Anderson of Baillie Gifford. James is the lead manager of the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust, which I know a lot of Money Week readers will hold because it's inside our investment trust portfolio. It's been a stunning performer over the last 3 years, up about 90% when the benchmark is up more like 35–40%. So it's done very well for those of us who have had it. So I'm going to start, James, just by asking you, what's the secret of this stunning success?
Well, that's very kind, Merit, but as you well know, it's the future that matters an awful lot more than what's happened in the past. But I do think there are some distinctive elements to our approach, which I would hope remain probably more important for the future than even they have been in the past. I'd probably start by saying that we don't really believe that the progress of share prices has much to do with the generalised economy, and this whole debate about what's the influence of monetary easing, what's going to happen in inflation, leaves me rather cold. What's critical to me and to our way of investing is that we think that there is a process of remarkably rapid change, exponential change, that drives the underlying businesses of companies. And perhaps a reflection on that, I happened to be coming across our original write-up of Google when it went public in 2004, just recently. And at that time, I don't know whether you remember, on an adjusted basis, what it earned. Well, the answer is 20 cents.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I do remember, because there was an article in Money Week saying you'd be crazy to buy this stock.
Well,
and I suspect that you thought the opposite.
Our response as a firm was much the same. Now, in that time, approximately on a split-adjusted basis, the share prices are up tenfold. The earnings are up 100-fold. That is real underlying business change. And I think that morphs into a second point, that most people think about share prices and picking shares as being roughly analogous to somebody walking into the room and you trying to guess whether they're going to be above or below average height. It's not like that. It's much more in a now fashionable era about wealth distribution. So instead, it's as though we're sitting in this room and Bill Gates walks in. It's about trying to capture those outlying stocks, which actually are a very major part of the process of stock market attainment. It's not your 6% per annum real or whatever people might imagine. So it's that. And why do we think that might become still more important? Well, I think this is where I get really excited, because both Tom, who works with me, and myself would argue pretty strongly that the process of change that we've seeing, though exciting, is now broadening out to areas that are actually much more important to humanity.
When you say the process of change, you're talking about the massive technological change of the last few years.
Yeah, to us it's about genuine underlying innovation. I, in some ways, I preferred the word innovation. I happened to be, I was in Long Island recently, so I thought I ought to reread The Great Gatsby. And there's this wonderful bit at the end when Gatsby's father's coming to his funeral, and he shows the narrator what Gatsby used to spend his day doing. And he spent an hour, I think it was at 6:30 a.m. in the morning, studying electricity. Now, I think technology is a bit like electricity these days. It's not really telling you about much what's changing. A definition of technology is something invented since we were born. It may be okay for you, but for me, at my age, this is problematical. But technology is really innovation to us. Now, that's broadening out, and I think in two ways. Firstly, geographically, which I'm sure we'll probably touch on, but also in terms of what it's addressing. And from having, however wonderful it is to be able to have, a computer powers information that was undreamt of even 10 years ago in your pocket on your phone, the importance of that compared to that hitting healthcare, energy, ultimately education and government seems to us minimal. Bill Gates wouldn't quite argue this now, given his excellent efforts in human healthcare, but I think he would concede, generally speaking, that his debates with Steve Jobs were, as the focus of this. And Steve Jobs always used to say that it's about when data hits biological sciences that it's going to become really interesting. And I think that is absolutely the case. And I think, if we have one area where we're constantly frustrated we can't do more, but we think the opportunities might be absolutely enormous, almost incomprehensible over the coming decade, it is in healthcare. And I think we have great difficulty with that notion, both of the concentration of returns and, if you like, the process of change itself. You know, we don't realise quite how dramatic, but our minds don't really cope with it. So, you know, I think that one of the best pieces of investment writing I've read recently, you may well have read it yourself, an article by Michael Moritz in Foreign Affairs, in which he said the biggest problem is we don't understand how great a great company can be. And you know, I think we see this in investment. You know, we're all taught to do analysis. We're all taught to go back to the figures. We think we're being serious in doing so, but we can't grasp that enormous and fabulous process of deep change that's going on.
Okay, so when you look at companies, you're not looking at valuations at all? Valuation is, I mean, we're talking here about wonderful change, huge innovation, buying Google at what looked like a bizarrely over high valuation at the time. Do you never return and say, well, hang on, this thing's really expensive? How on earth does that math add up?
You know, I'm sure to an extent you're teasing me, because I'm sure you believe that we do look at this, and we absolutely do look at this, but we try and think about it in different terms. We'll take up your Google reference. We quite like to call our process growth at an unreasonable price. You know, there are many growth at a reasonable price in this, and I think it captures it, because very often, if this change doesn't happen, what we're paying is unreasonable in the sense of being too high. But when these changes really do happen, then it's unreasonably cheap. So, for instance, I was mentioning Steve Jobs earlier, you know, return to Apple. Lots of people say 2008, 2009 was difficult times for you, etc. Was it? I mean, we were effectively able to buy Apple for under 2 times peak earnings. That's unreasonable price for those sort of returns at huge scale. So unreasonable in that sense, but I think it's also about, as you imply, our first task and our ultimate task. Now, we think, of course, the great joy of equities is your downside is 100%, and sadly sometimes we explore pretty close to that, but your upside is unlimited. Therefore, your first task as an investor is to understand and creatively think about what the upside is. Now, the discipline that comes with that is being obsessed, and I hope it really is being obsessed, at what are the chances of that happening, and what do we think we would pay for that happening. But I just don't think that's got anything to do with whether a stock's selling on 100 times prospective earnings or whether it's selling on 6 times prospective earnings. It is that harvest way out there in the future that is critically important, and your chances of the weather being supportive, you gathering that harvest.
Okay. Can I have an example of something that's in the portfolio at the moment that a value investor would look at and go, oh my God, the idiots, but that in fact is likely to be your Google, your next Google?
Well, funnily enough, it's one that I think has both gone through some of this process already and is set to do so more. And it's quite a convenient one to talk about because it's actually our largest holding, which is Illumina, the gene sequencing company. Now, I find this fascinating because actually we didn't really have to do that much of the process of prediction and thinking forward we were talking about, because by the time we bought Illumina, the cost of sequencing a human genome had fallen from $3 billion to approximately $100,000. Now, talking to the company and industry experts, it was fairly clear that that 100,000 was merely a stopping place, and the process of change is quicker than it is in Moore's law. So getting to the level at which this became useful from healthcare outcomes, from medicine, wasn't really a very risky prediction. So we thought this was well worth doing and that the world would change with it. And indeed it did, and the earnings and prospects of Illumina have gone up. But at this moment in time, Illumina is selling on a very high multiple of earnings, one that a growth investor might tolerate, a value one certainly wouldn't. But to us, actually the stock has become more attractive rather than less because the probability of that serious level of change has gone up. So not just do we know that, you know, in practical terms, the price of sequencing will fall below $1,000, but the chances of Illumina being the beneficiary of that have both got greater in competitive terms, and the prize is even greater. You know, I speak to people now, and they will tell you that approximately 90% of all the human genomes that have been sequenced have been done on Illumina equipment. Well, that's a pretty serious competitive advantage. And secondly, that probably all the coming generation will be sequenced at birth. And if you have serious illnesses, cancer being a very clear early example of this, you will probably be sequenced in detail and many times.
Yeah.
So, for everything from the good of humanity to the likelihood of this happening to the competitive advantage, I think the fact that this is on an extraordinarily high multiple of current earnings is not really the issue.
Okay. Now, we mentioned earlier briefly about how innovation is spreading out geographically as well. Is there a particular, obviously the Trust invests globally, but is there a particular area of the world that you feel is benefiting more than others from this shift?
Well, Marion, the first thing to say is that, and I'm glad you brought it up because it's something that Tom and I get very frustrated about. We find it really hard to fit in the standard blocks of asset allocation from this point of view, because we don't really think that countries matter that much. We think that innovation comes from specific cities and regions. And equally and oppositely, that there will be many cities and regions that are very wealthy, but barely produce a company. I challenge you, and you give me an answer afterwards. When did London last create a truly great company? It's good at circulating wealth, but creation of wealth seems to be a very different issue. So we think about our portfolio in terms of those cities and regions effectively. So we have approximately a bit over 30% of the portfolio that is in West Coast America. We have approximately zero, or very close to it, on East Coast America. So I think talking about America makes no sense at all. It's a very different model of capitalism, even in a country like that. But to give you a more concrete answer, we think that regardless of what happens to the Chinese real estate market or Chinese politics, that one of the most sensational developments of the last 3 or 5 years is that China has proved its ability to create really large-scale innovative companies with dominance of areas. So, I think the fact that Tencent, Alibaba and Baidu can exist at a scale that outside of America is just not being challenged by any non-West Coast companies is truly remarkable.
And the Trust is invested in all of those, isn't it?
Well,
Yes.
the Trust is invested in all of this. I think perhaps most interestingly, we bought Alibaba when it was still an unquoted company, and that's something else that we feel pretty strongly about. That one of the problems with our industry will be that many more companies, partly because they don't need capital, partly because of all the stress of being quoted, partly because they can invest when they're like this, will effectively choose not to go public until very late. Alibaba's, on its initial quotation prices rather than what the deal was done at, was worth $200 billion. Now, that's a bit of a problem at the first time.
It's very late float, historically speaking. Yeah. Are there any regions in the UK that fit your definition? You say London is very bad at creating new companies. Is there anywhere in the UK that you look at and you say, well, that's a region that really works?
Pretty wholly and solely, I'd say Cambridge is a long way in the lead. So, it may pain me as a graduate of Oxford, but, Cambridge is plainly, we own quite a lot of shares in Arm, which is plainly a direct instance of that. But I think it's also, Cambridge's got the sad side of it, because actually, I was talking about Illumina earlier, the core technologies behind Illumina were, and it's almost a parody, a caricature, were invented by people talking in a pub in Cambridge. And of course, they didn't really manage to commercialize it, to make it into a company, to have the development dollars, all the efforts involved in that. So I think, it really illustrates both the plus and the minuses. But I think your one, bringing up Cambridge is in some sense fascinating about Europe as a whole, because that's much more difficult to map than either East China or Northwest America. How is it, one of our largest holdings, Inditex, how is it that almost certainly, and I'm really not at this moment talking my book, but almost certainly the world's greatest clothing retailer grew up in a village on the Galician coast of Spain. And I think that level you have to come down to a selection of, particularly one individual, but a selection of individuals that are behind it.
Yeah.
The other place in Europe that I would mention, because I think it's intriguing, and we got to it almost serendipitously by accident, would be Berlin.
Yeah, where you spent some time recently, right?
So one of the things we do is we encourage people to go and spend about 3 months out in a place. It can be longer if they like, and one of my colleagues has just done this in India, for instance. But I did last year in Berlin, and that was provoked by something that I think we've talked about before, but a very different one from where I ended up. It was provoked by a real frustration with the British media that obsesses about telling us what people in London and New York think is going to happen in Europe. But doesn't really bother going to ask the Germans. And given that it's the Germans who makes the decisions, this always seemed rather odd to us. And, I'd richly tear up The Economist and the Financial Times and the like of it for its comments on these. So I went out trying to understand that in the process of politics. What instead I learned is that, what Berlin was in either the 1920s or the 1880s seems to me to be recurring. That you've got an enormous creative, ideologically quite anti-capitalist, hugely young people, hugely immigration, hugely cheap location-driven process of innovation out there, which I think is beginning to create a set of very, very different companies from what we think as traditional German companies, so Zalando and Rocket and the like.
Okay, so have you found some good things to invest in there? Where's the trust investing in Berlin?
Well, I mean, the one that's furthest in the completion process, this would probably be Zalando, and it seems odd even saying that because, it is Europe's leading online fashion retailer. And they effectively started out as one of these companies starting from scratch under the aegis of both Kinnevik in Sweden and Rocket, and moved onwards to this. Now, I think Rocket, which is effectively an internet incubator company, is the most fascinating example because effectively what they're doing is they're perhaps in a very Germanic way, they're industrializing the process of innovation. And they are deeply unpopular people in Silicon Valley because instead of saying you need to be geniuses, they say no, there is a business model here. And if we have 20 or 25 companies in, for instance, Nigeria, we know that the odds are favorable, we know what we're doing, and it will work. And you can replicate these business models. You don't need to be a genius. Now, I may think the founder is actually a genius for spotting this, but that's in a somewhat ironic sense. But I think it is a profoundly different model. And, we think you need those profoundly different models. It's like Inditex reversed the model of, instead of importing goods from China, they export from northern Spain to China, which seems, completely counterintuitive. So we think genuinely different business models are the proof of these cultural differences.
Okay. Now, I need to ask, I know your answer, I know what your answer will be, but I need to ask anyway. You have no concerns about the macro environment at all? With an eye on your portfolio and the worries about very high levels of valuation in the US, worries about the credit bubble, worries about the potential failure of monetary policy in the developed world, all these things that I worry about and that I think our readers worry about, and you don't appear to worry about at all. Well, I accept what you say about how the state of economies very rarely has an impact on stock markets. That's not the way it works. Yeah. But nonetheless, we do live in rather unusual times.
Well, the first thing, Marion, to say, and I hope you would acknowledge this is genuine thought, it's not just saying it for your audience. I think it's really important that there are people like you both talking about these issues and advising people to construct portfolios and incorporate them. Because really my argument is that I think it is incredibly important that people, whether through us or anything else, have some exposure to these great things that are happening out there. That's not saying their entire portfolio ought to be in it. I believe what I'm saying, there's no pretense about it, but I think having exposure is the important thing that I would plead to my more direct comments. I actually, if I worry about anything at the macro level, it's that what I'm talking about is too powerful, too important, and the process of change will be so dramatic that we can't cope with it.
What will happen?
Well, you can encapsulate it in the sort of worries that even someone like Elon Musk talks about we've probably done more in this field than anybody else, that artificial intelligence will take over the world and we won't be able to cope with it. But I think, on a slightly less dramatic level, one of the people we've paid a lot of attention to in recent years is Ian Morris, whose books you may have come across, and he makes, following people like Ray Kurzweil, the case that this exponential change is quickening all the time, and we're going to be facing more change in the next 30 years than really in accumulated history put together. Can we all cope with that? I don't know. How long do companies' real competitive advantage periods last against that? Just the chaos it may induce, the bad things that may happen. So, if anything, I worry that if you were to extend my ideas to their extreme, they become worrying in that fashion. The traditional worries, no, I don't really concern greatly with those. And, you'd be bored if I went through why in each specific case.
Fair enough. Now, it's not just it's not just industry, business, life that's going through phenomenal change. The fund management industry has also been seeing a period of change and will continue to do so as pension freedoms come on, etc. And I know Baillie Gifford has been in the forefront of trying to create a better business. Is there anything you wanted to say on that regarding the fee structures and investing styles, etc.?
Oh, I absolutely agree with your implications, Merryn. And I think in some ways fund managers have been very lucky because we've had investment bankers out there to attract the blame. By God, that they do that with style. But I think many of the ultimate decisions about how our companies can actually run, how they remunerate people, what their values are set by fund managers, and we have to take responsibility for that. And to my mind, I know what you concentrate on, and I think this is absolutely right, is on the ultimate value to savers. But I think as much as anything, it's also important for us to focus on how can we make companies better. And I think that's at a very, it's not us interfering day to day, it's a very strategic level. What are your competitive advantages? How do you make your competitive moat better? All the things that Buffett and Charlie Munger would be out there talking about. And I think that's not just critical from the point of view of the economic health that we're dealing with. I think it's ultimately, and I think this is what's so sad, it's far more satisfying as a fund manager to say you might have helped on this. I mentioned Illumina a couple of times. Actually, wasn't the analysis the most satisfying? By far the most satisfying facet of our involvement with Illumina is that we stopped them being taken over by Roche. I think that would have done huge damage, not just in shareholder terms, but in terms of human health and the prospects of it. And I think that level of involvement is really critical. I think it's shattering, even being a small conservative Edinburgh firm, how much companies, even some of the great companies, largest companies in the world, want to have shareholders doing this and have been deprived of having shareholders do this. Be blunt, does it translate into lower fees? Yeah, for sure. But if you can get the structure like this, if you can get fund managers who are not concerned about whether they're going to be sacked at the end of a year, but have the ability to think what's good for the corporate environment, what's good for savers over 10 years, 15 years, because they'll still be taking responsibility. I think we get a better world as an output from that. And as a fund manager, heck, you can cut our fees quite a lot and still have that security. You're much better off. So we will continue trying to get fees lower rather than higher.
Well, thank you, James. It's been cheered me up no end talking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Rick.
You told me 5 years ago, if you told me that the half the world would be in negative interest rates or something like that, I'd say, well, that'll last for about a week. But it really can last for quite a bit longer. And Japan has shown us how long.